The VP summoned me into his glass office on a Tuesday morning, a day when the markets were calm and the company calendar showed no sign of storms. Yet the atmosphere shifted the moment I stepped inside. His posture was rigid, his eyes unfocused, and papers were scattered in a way that betrayed a sleepless night. He cleared his throat, attempting professionalism, but his voice betrayed him. His hands trembled slightly as he slid a termination letter across the table, avoiding my gaze as though eye contact alone could incriminate him. There was no explanation, no performance review, and no warning. Just a sterile word printed in bold at the top of the page, restructuring. I read the letter twice, waiting for logic to appear between the lines. There was none. 13 years of service, erased in a paragraph. I had designed the financial models that kept this place alive during market turbulence. I had negotiated terms that even the board barely understood. My fingerprints were on every loan renewal, every hedge, every amortization schedule. Yet here I was, dismissed like a temp who overstayed his welcome. They didn't give me time to gather my thoughts. HR materialized at the doorway with the robotic precision of people coached to avoid empathy. They spoke in rehearsed phrases about severance and keys while avoiding every question I asked. Security escorted me to my desk, hovering close enough to make it clear I was no longer one of them. My colleagues watched from behind monitors, frozen between curiosity and terror. A few mouths opened, but no one dared speak. Silence is the corporate language of guilt. As I packed my belongings, I noticed something strange. Files I had locked the previous afternoon were missing. Not deleted, physically removed. Someone had opened my cabinet and extracted key documents tied to debt maturities and covenant triggers. Those records explained how the company's debt ladder worked, how each repayment linked to future refinancing clauses. Without them, anyone trying to navigate the structure would be flying blind. My absence wasn't about cost-cutting. It was about control, specifically, removing the one person capable of exposing a dangerous truth. The final walk through the lobby felt like a funeral procession. Heads didn't turn out of sympathy. They turned out of fear of association. Everyone knew companies don't fire the architect of a $2 billion balance sheet without motive. Restructuring was a smokescreen. Something hidden was brewing, something the VP didn't want me anywhere near. They thought pushing me out would bury the problem. They forgot one detail. Burying a problem doesn't kill it. It only forces someone else to dig. When the revolving doors closed behind me, anger wasn't what I felt. It was clarity. They believed escorting me out ended the story. They didn't realize they had unlocked a new one. In 13 years, I hadn't just built their financial backbone, I had memorized every secret, loophole, and weakness. And the moment they fired me, those secrets stopped working for them. They started working for me. They expected me to walk away and lick my wounds in silence, like countless employees discarded before me. The VP assumed the termination letter and humiliating escort would be enough to discourage curiosity. But corporate history is littered with leaders who underestimated the wrong person. I wasn't angry, I was analytical. My exit didn't sever my connection to the company. It sharpened it. Instead of sleeping, I spent the following days poring over the company's public filings, annual reports, and debt disclosures like a surgeon retracing an operation gone wrong. It began innocently enough, with a desire to understand why a profitable enterprise would abruptly remove the one person fluent in its financial language. Yet every document I opened raised more questions than answers. The debt schedules I once updated were now altered with suspicious adjustments. Callable loans, which were previously dormant, had been activated. I noticed interest triggers tied to variable benchmarks that could never be met without my intervention. These weren't innocent oversights, they were deliberate traps. When I compared the most recent filings to those I had personally prepared months earlier, inconsistencies screamed louder than accusations. Provisions had been modified to include penalties that would activate under specific conditions. Those conditions weren't theoretical, they were imminent. And there it was, the VP's signature on every amendment. He had altered covenant clauses tied to refinancing deadlines, knowing the board would never grasp the financial implications. Without my calculations, the system he patched together was destined to implode. The realization was chilling. I hadn't just been part of the machine, I had been the firewall keeping it from self-destructing. Every time a lender raised concerns, I addressed them. Every time the credit rating wavered, I strengthened the structure. The VP took credit, but he didn't understand the architecture. He treated debt like a faucet that could be turned on and off at will. He forgot that water pressure, once unleashed, could blow through walls. My curiosity transformed into urgency. The company wasn't simply unstable, it was sitting on a financial landmine. Without me managing cash flows, interest rate hedges, and covenant thresholds, the countdown had begun. Callable loans worth hundreds of millions were weeks away from triggering repayment demands. Once activated, the domino effect would be unstoppable. Banks wouldn't negotiate. They would seize assets, call guarantees, and dismantle the company piece by piece. Leadership had assumed my departure created silence. In reality, it created perspective. From outside the building, the picture became clear. The VP wasn't orchestrating a restructuring. He was gambling the company's future to cover his past mistakes. He fired the one person who knew how to prevent disaster, hoping absence would erase accountability. It didn't. Instead, it exposed a truth they couldn't control. My quiet exit was their loudest error. I was gone, but the financial system I built was still ticking, and without its architect, the clock was counting down. The VP didn't just fire me, he amputated the company's memory. What he failed to grasp was that our financial ecosystem wasn't a spreadsheet anyone could open and understand. It was a living organism, stitched together over years of negotiations, delayed maturities, hedge instruments, and compliance clauses buried so deep that even auditors skimmed past them. He believed removing me was an administrative decision. In reality, he removed the only surgeon who knew which arteries kept the company alive. Our loan agreements weren't simple debts. They were engineered mechanisms designed to be both shield and sword. Each instrument depended on another, one bond linked to EBITDA ratios, another tied to quarterly reporting deadlines, and a revolving credit facility that required compliance certificates filed within a precise window. It wasn't just numbers, these were tripwires. Miss one filing by 48 hours, and lenders gained the right to demand repayment of hundreds of millions instantly. Forget to update a liquidity ratio, and an entire covenant chain snapped, triggering interest escalations capable of wiping out a fiscal year's profit. I spent years making sure those alarms never went off. I negotiated extensions when markets destabilized. I recalculated thresholds when revenues dipped unexpectedly. I settled disputes with creditors who wanted blood instead of patience. It wasn't heroism, it was survival. What the VP saw as paperwork was, in truth, the silent war that kept the company breathing. The deeper tragedy was that no one realized these obligations weren't self-managed. Department heads thought the Treasury team handled them. Treasury assumed legal tracked deadlines. Legal assumed the CFO reviewed covenants. The CFO trusted me. And the VP, drunk on titles, trusted no one. The entire structure survived because I understood which contracts were harmless decor and which were ticking grenades disguised as financing tools. Without me, the company wasn't just exposed, it was defenseless. The VP's arrogance reached its peak when he approved amendments without understanding them. He signed off on variable rate clauses tied to benchmarks he couldn't pronounce. He approved debt swaps without realizing they demanded liquidity levels we never had. He ignored the fine print that turned friendly lenders into predators once ratios slipped below agreed thresholds. He admired the castle, but never questioned its foundations. When he removed me, he assumed the castle would stand because it always had. What he didn't understand was that I had been reinforcing those foundations every single quarter, patching cracks others pretended not to see. He replaced expertise with confidence. Confidence doesn't keep the lights on when banks start knocking. No one left inside the company even knew the alarms existed, let alone how to disarm them. And the alarms were already counting down. Debt isn't dangerous because it exists, it's dangerous because it waits. The VP thought he removed an employee. He removed the fuse that kept the bomb from exploding. 3 weeks after my dismissal, the quiet I had imposed on myself fractured. It was early morning when my phone rang, the caller ID displaying a name I barely recognized, a junior analyst who had joined the finance department barely a year before I left. His voice was panicked, breathless, the kind of tone that belonged to someone who had stumbled into a battlefield without armor. He apologized for calling, then launched into a torrent of words that barely formed sentences. Compliance certificates, filing deadlines, covenant ratios, bank inquiries, meetings he didn't request, numbers he didn't understand, fear he couldn't hide. I let him speak until he ran out of air. Then I asked one question. Who assigned him the task? When he whispered the VP's name, the final piece of the puzzle locked into place. The VP hadn't just fired me. He had reassigned my responsibilities to someone who didn't even know what the responsibilities were. And that was the moment I realized disaster wasn't approaching, it had already begun. The analyst explained he'd received automated notices from lenders requesting clarification on liquidity buffers and leverage ratios. He assumed they were routine. They weren't. Those requests meant thresholds had already been breached. I had designed those guardrails to prevent panic, but they also served as alarms for when something went wrong. Banks don't request meetings out of curiosity. They do it when they smell blood in the water. I asked the analyst to forward the compliance documentation. When the files arrived, I almost couldn't believe what I was looking at. The quarterly certificates were incomplete. Ratios were calculated with outdated figures. Debt maturities were listed incorrectly. Someone inside was signing documents they didn't understand and, worse, sending them to institutions trained to weaponize ignorance. The VP's confidence had crossed into negligence. He believed compliance was a checkbox, not a covenant. He saw numbers as decorative accessories rather than triggers engineered into contracts. He forgot that numbers are weapons, especially when misunderstood. They don't forgive egos. They expose them. With every page I reviewed, the consequences clarified. Missed deadlines had activated clauses. Misreported figures had unlocked lender rights. Callable loans worth hundreds of millions now hung like a guillotine over the company's balance sheet. A single forced repayment would be devastating. Several at once would be fatal. The analyst asked if he should notify the VP. I told him no. Not yet. A drowning man doesn't listen to warnings, he pulls others under. What the VP needed wasn't advice. What he needed was reality. As I ended the call, the weight of what was coming settled on me. The company wasn't edging toward a problem. It was sprinting into one. They fired the only person who understood the system, then handed the detonator to someone who didn't know it was live. That call didn't just confirm the VP's mistake. It announced the countdown. The collapse didn't arrive with alarms or headlines. It arrived quietly, hidden inside a document that should have taken 10 minutes to complete, but instead became the match that ignited a financial inferno. When the company submitted its quarterly compliance package, sloppy, incomplete, and mathematically incoherent, the lenders reacted exactly as the contracts allowed them to. A covenant breach wasn't a suggestion. It was a trigger. And this trigger was tied to something far larger than the VP ever imagined, an accelerated repayment clause worth $400 million. It happened overnight. Emails began arriving before dawn, first from automated systems, then from real people with real authority. Lenders demanded immediate repayment. Not renegotiation. Not discussion. Repayment, every penny. They didn't care about the VP's restructuring narrative, internal politics, wounded pride, or ignorance. Credit agreements are not sentimental. They're predatory by design, and the moment the compliance threshold was crossed, the lenders gained teeth sharp enough to tear through any corporate shield. Inside the building, panic replaced routine. Analysts froze at their desks, staring at figures they couldn't justify. Cash flow teams scrambled through spreadsheets, hoping hidden reserves existed somewhere. They didn't. The company barely had enough liquidity to cover quarterly operations, let alone hundreds of millions. Those who had nodded passively when the VP bragged about modernizing finance now whispered in hallways, terrified of the numbers staring back at them. Investors were the next to react. They didn't ask polite questions, they demanded explanations. Overnight, stock sentiment shifted from curiosity to suspicion. Why were lenders activating repayment demands? Why did filings contain errors a graduate intern could have avoided? Why was the VP suddenly avoiding calls and canceling meetings? Markets don't fear uncertainty. They destroy companies that create it. And the VP had unknowingly crafted the perfect recipe for a catastrophic loss of confidence. Meanwhile, lawyers descended like emergency surgeons. They tore through agreements, hunting for grace periods, exceptions, escape clauses, anything that could buy time. But contracts don't reward ignorance. Every loophole I had once secured, every extension I once negotiated, every legal shield I crafted was tied to actions I personally executed. Without me, those protections were dead letters. The VP didn't inherit authority when he fired me. He inherited responsibility. And responsibilities don't care about titles. When pressed by the board, the VP blamed system errors. He claimed software miscalculations, staff negligence, and evolving regulatory conditions. But the truth was far simpler. The system wasn't broken. The knowledge had been fired. Debt structures don't manage themselves. Cash flow coverage doesn't appear out of thin air. Covenant formulas don't bend because someone in a suit doesn't understand them. The company had survived for years because someone protected it from triggers they never realized existed. The VP believed numbers were harmless until they turned against him. He didn't just lose control. He activated a $400 million countdown, and there was no one left who knew how to stop it. The crisis didn't stay confined within corporate walls. Financial journalists possess a sixth sense for weakness, and once lenders began whispering about accelerated repayment demands, reporters followed the scent like wolves tracking an injured animal. Within days, headlines spread across major outlets, each one more brutal than the last. Fortune 500 firm faces potential collapse over hidden debt. Leadership miscalculates debt exposure. $400 million covenant breach uncovered. The story wasn't just news, it was spectacle. Analysts dissected balance sheets on live broadcasts, commentators speculated on leadership failures, and investors dumped shares before breakfast. The VP tried to maintain composure at first, insisting the situation was exaggerated. But his confidence evaporated when television anchors replayed statements he once gave about modernizing finance and streamlining legacy processes. Those same words now cemented him as the architect of negligence. His name, once proudly displayed on conference stages and investor brochures, became associated with incompetence. Silence replaced swagger. His once flamboyant presentations were replaced with short, nervous memos delivered through intermediaries. Former employees, people he dismissed or ignored, found their voices. Some spoke anonymously, others publicly. They didn't attack him with emotion, they used facts. They described years of warnings about covenant sensitivity, liquidity risks, and the fragility of the company's debt ladder. Their accounts painted a portrait of a leader more interested in appearances than understanding. The media didn't need to embellish anything. The truth was damning enough. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted from controlled to venomous. The same directors who once applauded the VP's boldness now moved their chairs away from him, as though scandal were contagious. Every question became an interrogation. Every silence became an admission. At first, he attempted deflection, blaming software glitches, outdated systems, even the complexity of financial markets. But excuses collapse when numbers tell a different story. One board member asked a question that echoed through the room. If this was a system error, why did it activate after the one person who understood the system was dismissed? No one spoke after that. The VP stopped making eye contact. His once commanding voice shrank into monotone answers. He avoided hallways where employees gathered, took side entrances to avoid reporters stationed at the front doors, and began arriving before dawn to minimize encounters. Each day seemed to age him a year. Leadership no longer looked at him with admiration. They looked at him with suspicion and, more dangerously, regret. Meanwhile, social media erupted with theories, diagrams, leaked snippets of board discussions, and investor speculation. Hashtags trended. Commentators compared the unfolding disaster to infamous corporate collapses. Competitors seized the moment, courting clients and employees who no longer trusted the sinking ship. What began as a confidential compliance issue had evolved into a public indictment of leadership incompetence. For the first time in his career, the VP faced something he couldn't manipulate, charm, or ignore. He faced accountability. And accountability doesn't blink. The call didn't surprise me. Desperation never knocks politely. It barges in without dignity. When the board's assistant reached out, her voice carried the exhaustion of people who had finally realized that arrogance was not a strategy. She didn't use grand language or corporate pleasantries. She asked one question: would I consider returning? It was remarkable how quickly titles, hierarchies, and inflated egos evaporate when numbers threaten survival. The VP who once strutted across the office like a visionary now couldn't even dial my number himself. I didn't return as an employee. Those days were over. I returned as a consultant, my choice, my conditions, my rules. The same expertise they had dismissed now came at 10 times the cost. They accepted without hesitation. When fear grips a boardroom, money becomes a secondary concern. Survival becomes the only language spoken. Walking back into the building was surreal. The same lobby that once echoed with silent stares now vibrated with tension. Employees avoided eye contact, not out of contempt, but reverence. They finally understood what leadership never had. Systems don't run on charisma, they run on competence. In the boardroom, executives sat stiffly, each clutching reports like lifelines. The VP looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched, his confidence drained. He didn't greet me. He couldn't. His silence was an apology he didn't know how to articulate. The board chair gestured toward the presentation setup. What they wanted wasn't a status update. They wanted a lifeline. I began by explaining the crisis, not emotionally, not vindicatively, but clinically. Numbers don't require drama. They carry their own. I showed how incomplete documentation triggered the acceleration clause, how covenant breaches cascaded into lender rights, and how the absence of oversight turned manageable liabilities into a $400 million demand. Each slide struck harder than the last. The VP flinched at every benchmark he had ignored, every deadline he had treated like decoration. His ignorance was no longer embarrassing. It was catastrophic. Then I laid out the solution. Not a miracle, not a bailout, but a structured plan. Renegotiate maturities, freeze discretionary spending, activate unused credit lines, liquidate non-essential assets, and restore covenant compliance through corrected filings. My proposals weren't genius, they were foundational. But without the architect, foundations had been forgotten. As I affixed my signature to the updated compliance certificates, the tension broke. The room exhaled. The market wouldn't forgive their mistake, but it would pause the execution. That pause was worth millions. My signature, once ignored, once dismissed, had become the only currency that mattered. Executives leaned back, relieved, humbled, shaken. They didn't thank me. Gratitude requires humility, and corporate leaders rarely possess it. But their silence was louder than applause. They finally understood the irony. The man they discarded had become the only person capable of saving them. They fired an employee. They hired a necessity. And necessities don't come cheap. Revenge rarely looks like fury. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. The board convened an emergency session the week after my return, and for the first time, no one defended the VP. Numbers were stronger witnesses than accusations. The covenant breaches, the unauthorized amendments, the triggered repayments, each one formed a trail that pointed not to error, but to leadership negligence. The directors, once hypnotized by the VP's buzzwords and grandiose promises, now studied him the way surgeons study a tumor, calculating where to cut to save the host. His fate was sealed in a single vote. The VP was removed from his position effective immediately. There was no farewell speech, no final applause, no hallway sympathy. Security escorted him out the same way they escorted me weeks earlier, except this time, the silence carried a different meaning. It wasn't shock, it was relief. His stock options were frozen pending investigation, his corporate privileges revoked, and his carefully curated legacy evaporated in a single afternoon. He once told everyone that numbers were tools. He finally learned they were verdicts. Investors who had once doubted the company's direction now publicly credited my intervention. News outlets that previously questioned the firm's survival ran updated stories. Covenant crisis stabilized after strategic consulting move. Commentators who dissected the VP's leadership failures now praised the calm reconstruction of the debt structure. I didn't bask in the attention. I didn't need to. Reputation, once earned, doesn't require marketing. It spreads on its own. What surprised the board most wasn't my return, but my departure. After stabilizing the company, I didn't stay for applause or a corner office. I left with something infinitely more powerful: leverage. My newly formed consulting firm received inquiries from 3 competitors within days, companies that valued skill over ego, foresight over theatrics, and numbers over narratives. They didn't want a figurehead. They wanted an architect. And this time, I set my terms without hesitation. I never raised my voice during the ordeal. I never threatened retaliation. I never chased revenge. I didn't need to. All I did was step away. Protection is invisible until it's gone. The company didn't collapse because I attacked it. It collapsed because it never understood what held it up. A structure built on ego cannot survive once competence leaves the room. My work became a case study, not in sabotage, but in accountability. Competitors referenced it in board meetings. Investors cited it in due diligence sessions. Executives, once intoxicated by confidence, now asked different questions, not who looks impressive, but who understands the system. Somewhere, in a quiet office stripped of authority, the former VP replayed the sequence of decisions that led him here. His downfall wasn't orchestrated by malice. It was authored by ignorance. He fired the gatekeeper. The gates collapsed. And the world finally understood a lesson I learned long ago. You don't destroy a fortress by attacking its walls. You remove the person who knows where the keys are.